For the negative test, they pumped 424 barrels of 16 pound per gallon lost circulation material down the drill pipe into the well as a spacer. Why they used LCM and the consequences of that decision we'll come to later on. They followed the spacer with 352 barrels of seawater, which should have displaced the tail end of the spacer to just above the BOP. They then closed the annular BOP. The U-tube pressure on the drill pipe was 2,325 psi. Next, they bled off the drill pipe to try to get the pressure to zero. They bled off 50 barrels, which is 5 to 10 times as much as would be expected. This suggested something was not right. So after some investigation, they found the mud level in the riser had dropped, indicating the annular was leaking. So they increased closing pressure on the annular to make it seal, topped up the riser with 50 barrels of mud, and monitored the well to make sure the annular was now sealing. But now, instead of being above the BOP, the LCM spacer was strung out across it, and as we will see, this would have consequences later on. With the annular sealed, they continued with the negative test. Drill pipe pressure at the start was 1200 psi. They bled off 15 more barrels, and the pressure reduced to zero, as expected. In fact, the bleed-off volume was the first visible indication of an integrity problem with the well. But the volume rang no alarm bells because they hadn't calculated how much fluid was expected to be bled off to reach zero. The extra volume needed would have indicated that the test had failed, because later calculations showed that it should only have taken 3.5 barrels to bleed off the pressure, a fifth of what they actually got. For the first time since those formations were drilled, the well was underbalanced and started to flow. The other 11.5 barrels bled off was an influx of hydrocarbons into the production casing through the shoe. They had in fact induced a kick. But the opportunity to recognize the kick may have been missed because of a procedural change. The well site leader realized that to suspend the well in accordance with the permit, they needed to perform the negative test via the kill line, not the drill pipe. So they reset the test and essentially started again before the bleed-off volume was questioned or a rise in pressure in the drill pipe was noticed. Following the well site leader's instructions, they opened the kill line and observed some fluid coming out of it. Exactly how much is unclear. Some eyewitnesses said that flow eventually stopped, but others said that fluid was still spurting out when they closed the line. If the test was successful, there shouldn't have been any flow, as the drill pipe had been bled to zero. They discussed the flow they'd seen and decided to open the kill line again, but first they rerouted it to the mini trip tank. They opened the kill line again and monitored it for 30 minutes, and this time there was no flow. But in the meantime, the drill pipe pressure built up to 1400 psi. If all was well, this would not have happened. The test did not apply any additional fluid, so there should have been no pressure source. The most likely source was a formation fluid influx. The well had flowed. The drill pipe and the kill line were both filled with water. They should have been at the same pressure. The readings didn't match this expectation, so the rig team tried to understand why. This is a moment where a critical decision was made. With hindsight, these anomalous readings suggest that the test had failed and the well had flowed. To understand why the readings weren't acted on, we need to look at the decision-making process. First of all, bear in mind that although this was a challenging job, everything seemed to be drawing to a satisfactory conclusion. All indications were that the difficult cement job had gone well. The floats had held, the positive test had been good, and there was no fluid coming out of the open kill line. The job was nearly finished. There were 2 senior BP well site leaders supervising the negative test, and they had a discussion about the anomalous readings with the senior rig crew. And a Transocean tool pusher and driller offered an explanation, saying they had seen this phenomenon before, and it was called the bladder effect. The idea of the so-called bladder effect is that the heavy mud in the riser can exert pressure through the annular onto the fluid below it, because the annular is a flexible seal. This appeared to explain the anomalous readings. With no fluid having come out of the kill line for 30 minutes, the negative test was deemed successful. This is one of the critical decision points in the series of events, because with hindsight we know that the negative test had failed and hydrocarbons had entered the production casing. Understanding this chain of decision-making is crucial to learning from the accident. Note that the bladder effect is not known to exist. It's not a proven phenomenon, and in hindsight it was not a viable explanation for the anomalous pressure readings. This could have been confirmed by bleeding some of the pressure from the drill pipe. If pressure had started to rise again, which it would have indicated the negative test had failed. Instead, the well site leaders and the senior rig crew accepted the bladder effect explanation. There was a problem to solve. They had what seemed like a logical, convincing and benign explanation. Unfortunately, that explanation turned out not to be true. Putting aside for a moment the events on the Deepwater Horizon, in our operations there are often situations where the observed data is hard to explain or contradicts what we believe to be happening. In those situations we need to be cautious of a phenomenon known as confirmation bias, which is the natural human tendency to focus on information that confirms and supports one's preconceptions, and to discount other information. If the whole team is influenced by confirmation bias, and by groupthink convinces themselves that there cannot be a well control problem, it can prevent them from recognizing one when it develops. We must continually look out for potential preconceptions and not discount the possibility that the well could be flowing, that a negative outcome could be developing. It is critical to assess all the possible explanations for a well issue, not just the one that you believe is most likely. It's also essential to test the explanations, even credible ones, and not just accept them. We do not know why there was no flow out of the kill line. There should have been with 1400 psi on the drill pipe. If they'd seen flow, they would have known there was a problem. One credible explanation is that the kill line had become plugged with the LCM spacer that had leaked into the BOP through the annular at the start of the test. The spacer was an LCM pill made from Formoset and Formosqueeze, which is a thick, gungy, solids-laden pill. It was used because it was in the mud pits, where it had been kept in case it was needed during drilling. But after drilling, they needed to dispose of it. And once it's been pumped down the well, regulations allow it to be disposed of overboard. So using the LCM pill as a spacer enabled this disposal solution. And of course, the LCM would not have been near the kill line if the annular hadn't leaked. It's also possible that when they rerouted the kill line to the mini trip tank, a valve was inadvertently left closed, so the kill line was never opened to the production casing pressure in the first place. We can't know for sure why there was no flow from the kill line. Certainly the type of spacer plus the leaking annular is a logical explanation. The sequence of events surrounding the negative pressure test is one of the key findings of the investigation. The unusually high bleed volumes were not identified as a problem. The anomalous pressure readings, 1400 psi on the drill pipe and no flow from the kill line, should have rung alarm bells in the supervisors' heads. Instead, a possible explanation was assigned, but not tested. The approved method of testing was not correctly identified before the test started, leading to the test being halted and changed halfway through. This confusion made it easier to miss the failure of the first test. The pass and fail criteria were not clear. The test was incorrectly accepted as successful, despite indications to the contrary. The decision to call the test a success, in spite of the pressure anomalies, was made on the rig, with little or no involvement from the onshore team.
3 preventative barriers had now been breached: the annular cement barrier, the shoe track, and the negative pressure test.
After the negative test, at 1955, the suspension program continued. With both the positive and negative pressure tests apparently successful, they opened the annular. As soon as they did that, the well was overbalanced again, so further hydrocarbon flow was prevented. At 20:02, in preparation for suspending the well, they began displacement to seawater to get the heavy mud and spacer out of the riser. The primary well control barrier included the mud in the riser that they were now removing. 50 minutes later, enough mud was removed for the well to go underbalanced. Hydrocarbons began to flow into the well again. Returns of fluid from the riser now exceeded inflow as the rising hydrocarbons displaced fluid up the well. The pit level started to increase. The pit gain may have been missed because at this point they decided to empty the trip tank down the flow line and into the active tank. So seeing a pit gain wasn't surprising. After all, they were adding excess fluid themselves. By emptying the trip tank when they did, they made effective monitoring of the well more difficult. This is a real-time data chart of drill pipe pressure and flows on the deepwater horizon in the hour leading up to the blowout. The data on this chart is very revealing. At 21:02, pressure began rising in the drill pipe. But as they were pumping seawater at a constant rate, and the mud in the riser was being displaced by seawater, the pressure should have been falling. It was rising because the lighter kick fluids were replacing heavy mud below the drill pipe. By 21:08, the spacer was at surface, so they shut down the pumps so that they could do a sheen test to check there was no oil in the spacer before dumping it overboard. Two key things happened. Instead of stopping in seconds, as it should have done when the pump was stopped, the flow out of the riser continued for 1 or 2 more minutes, pushed by the rising hydrocarbons in the well. And the pressure in the drill pipe began to rise for the same reason. With the pump shut down, there was nothing on the rig to generate this excess pressure. It was now 5 hours since the first influx during the negative test, and no well control actions had been taken. Remember, these were all smart, experienced professionals just like you. Things that seem clear in hindsight may have been missed in the efforts to finish a difficult job that appeared to be going to plan, given the cased, cemented and tested wellbore. Computer modelling suggests that up to this point the influx was relatively small, perhaps 30 or 40 barrels. The influx was flowing at quite a slow rate, but it was accelerating. At 21:15, with the sheen test complete, the pumps were restarted. Because there was believed to be no risk of oil contamination, flow was rerouted straight over the side. At this point, there was no way to monitor flow volumes or rates out of the well. As they continued pumping, the pressure continued to rise steadily in the drill pipe, and the most likely reason for this was that the well was flowing. But no well control actions were taken. All the returns were now going overboard. At 21:30, they stopped the pumps. While they were off, the drill pipe pressure climbed by more than 550 psi in 5 minutes. The investigation indicated that the well must have been flowing at an increasing rate. Though eyewitnesses reported there was a discussion on the drill floor about differential pressure, no well control actions were taken. Subsequent computer modelling put the total influx at this point at around 300 barrels.
A fourth barrier to the accident had now been breached. Lack of effective well monitoring meant no one recognized the influx.
With the pumps off, at 21:34, you can see that the pressure in the drill pipe stopped rising. This was a bad sign because it indicated that the influx had now reached above the end of the drill pipe. That was more than a 550 barrel kick. Although people on the rig floor were concerned about the differential pressure, still no one took any action to shut in the well. Concerned by the pressure in the drill pipe, the driller apparently tried to bleed it off, and you could see the pressure drop rapidly. But as soon as they shut the bleed off, the pressure immediately increased almost back to where it had been. The well was flowing. The rate of flow was increasing, but all the returns were going overboard, which made it more difficult to recognize the flow. By 21:38, the kick size was calculated to be 700 barrels. The influx was now in the riser and above the BOP. This was an absolutely critical moment. The BOP could no longer prevent the explosive hydrocarbons from reaching the surface. At 21:41, mud and fluids being pushed up ahead of the hydrocarbons overflowed onto the rig floor. A minute later it began to shoot up the derrick. Witnesses described it as being like a waterfall raining down from the rig floor to the deck below. Based on the lack of response until this point, this appears to be the first time a well control problem was recognized. It was 3 minutes too late to stop the hydrocarbons entering the riser with the BOP. That barrier had already been breached. At 21:42, pressure in the drill pipe began to climb. Most likely this is because they closed the annular. It doesn't appear to have sealed properly because the pressure in the drill pipe climbed slowly for the next 5 or 6 minutes. At 21:47, the pressure suddenly increased rapidly, likely either because they closed one or more pipe rams or because the annular finally sealed off the flow. Pressure in the drill pipe shot up to over 5,500 psi. So by 21:47 it appears that the well was finally shut in, almost an hour after it began to flow. But it was too late. The hydrocarbons were already in the riser above the BOP and heading rapidly for the rig. As we know, the BOP is a blowout preventer, not a blowout stopper. It has to be used early enough to be effective. If the influx enters the riser, the BOP can no longer prevent it from reaching the rig. In this case, it could still possibly have reduced the severity of the blowout, but it wasn't activated soon enough.
The fifth barrier to the accident had now been breached. The response actions, when they were taken by the crew, failed to regain control of the well because the hydrocarbons were already above the BOP.
Now we will look at the third critical factor, that hydrocarbons ignited on the deepwater horizon. To stop mud from raining down on the rig floor, they closed the diverter. It was the right action. It's what it was designed for, to keep the fluids off the rig floor so they could regain control. Unfortunately, the diverter was lined up so that instead of going overboard, the returns went to the mud gas separator. The MGS is a low-pressure, relatively low-volume vessel. The flow rate from the well, which is estimated to have peaked at 165 million standard cubic feet a day, was so high it simply overwhelmed the MGS. Hydrocarbons poured from the derrick vent into the mudroom and from the rupture disc, and most likely from the slip joint as well. Within seconds, flammable gases would have covered most of the rig.
Thus, the sixth barrier was breached. Diversion to the mud gas separator resulted in gas venting onto the rig.
The first explosion occurred at 21:49. We don't know the source of ignition, possibly one of the engines or a piece of electrical switchgear. But clearly the fire and explosion prevention systems, although they may have detected the gas cloud, did not prevent ignition. Eyewitnesses reported that at least one engine went into overspeed before the first explosion.
This was the seventh barrier that was breached. The rig's fire and gas system did not prevent hydrocarbon ignition, leading to the fire and explosions and loss of life.
Now let's look at the fourth and final critical factor. The emergency well control system did not seal the well. As well as causing major damage to the rig and serious and fatal injuries, the explosions appear to have damaged the MUX control cables to the BOP. At this stage, an annular was already closed, and likely one or more VBRs. With damage to the MUX and hydraulic connections between rig and BOP, the annular would gradually relax open as hydraulic pressure fell. But the VBR would have remained closed. However, the VBR didn't hold. The problem was that the explosion blacked out the rig, and because the Deepwater Horizon was dynamically positioned, it began to drift off location. At this point, the seal on the BOP was broken, and uncontrolled flow from the well resumed. There are two possible reasons for this. Either the drill pipe was parted, opening up a pathway inside of the VBR, or alternatively, the drill pipe was dragged through the closed VBR until a tool joint reached the ram and damaged it. Either way, uncontrolled hydrocarbon flow was again feeding the fire on the rig. At this point, the crew triggered the emergency disconnect system to activate the blind shear rams and disconnect the riser. But this relied on the MUX cables to function, and they had already failed, so the EDS did not activate. When the MUX cables or hydraulic lines failed, the automatic mode function, AMF deadman system, should have automatically triggered the blind shear rams and sealed the well. But this did not happen. Why? The AMF was controlled by two redundant pods. These each contain two 9-volt batteries that power the control electronics, and a 27-volt battery that triggers various relays and ultimately a solenoid valve to release hydraulic fluid to operate the blind shear ram. When the pods were later recovered, the investigation discovered that in the blue pod, one 9-volt battery and the 27-volt battery were either flat or largely discharged to the extent that they could not power the AMF. In the yellow pod, the batteries were healthy, but a solenoid valve control system had been incorrectly wired during maintenance, so the AMF failed to operate. So, although the AMF had dual redundancy, both control systems failed to operate for different reasons. The AMF deadman system was the last line of defense to shut the well in. Later attempts to trigger the AMF manually using an ROV appeared to succeed, but failed to seal the well, possibly because the drill pipe was off-center in the BOP, or because the low pump rates of the ROVs at that time caused the sealing elements of the ram to be washed out before a seal could be made. The Macondo well was now discharging oil into the Gulf of Mexico, and it would continue to do so for 87 days.
This was the 8th and final barrier that was breached. The BOP emergency mode didn't seal the well. We must remember the mechanical and operational failures that led to the tragic loss of 11 men and one of the largest accidental oil spills in U.S. history, and make sure we do our part to never allow those or similar failures to be repeated.